While the militiamen in Oregon have not fired any shots, media critics are asking why the mainstream press has repeatedly described an armed group of men who have taken over a government facility as peaceful demonstrators or activists. Some have even questioned the government's response, comparing police reaction to protests in Baltimore, for example, where the National Guard was called in. Well, to take a closer look at all of this, let's talk now to Will Potter, investigative journalist and author of Green is the New Red. Nice to see you, Will. Ironically, these militiamen in Oregon are occupying a wildlife reservation. And I say this is ironic because thanks to your work, we know that if you were an environmental activist, perhaps organizing to preserve that land, or were an animal rights activist, the FBI would consider you a terrorist. So what do you make of the media and government's response to what's been happening in Oregon?
And I think that distinction is not just a rhetorical one about the media coverage we're seeing and the use of language and the restraint in not calling these armed militia members as terrorists, but in how the police actually handle situations like this, how law enforcement and the courts handle it as well. We're seeing this just incredible amount of reluctance to label these groups as, even as what they are, as an armed resistance movement, while at the same time labeling nonviolent animal rights and environmental activists as the FBI's #1 domestic terrorist threat. And these groups have never taken up arms. They've never done anything like this whatsoever.
Well, a question that I find interesting, though, Will, is why the reaction when we critique the media is to say, why aren't we calling them terrorists, or why aren't we calling them terrorists? And you hear people who, would consider themselves liberal basically advocating for expanding the use of the phrase rather than stepping back and having a conversation about how the words terrorist and terrorism are so politicized. Why should we be increasing its use?
I think that's a really excellent point. I mean, I think the media coverage of this standoff has failed in the regard that it hasn't been describing these armed militia groups as what they are. And it certainly, when juxtaposed with the Black Lives Matter movement, with the Ferguson protests, with Baltimore. But at the same time, the answer to that should not mean erring on the opposite end of the spectrum and just trying to label more and more things as terrorism. I think we need to exercise a bit of restraint as journalists in how that incredibly powerful terminology is being used. Quite recklessly in that regard. I mean, it used to be in Associated Press style books and New York Times manuals about how we use language that we're told to use incredible amount of restraint in how we're characterizing these groups. And now it just seems to be done selectively based on the politics of those responsible.
Well, what do you think then, Will? I want you to explain what the meaning of the word is as someone who has been tracked by the government for your work.
That was one of the most difficult things in writing my book, is trying to identify a shared definition of that term of terrorism. And if there's anything I walked away with, is that the term is always used as a political weapon against the enemy of the hour. It's a malleable term that can be manipulated and distorted based on the whims of whoever is in power. And that's part of what motivates me to say that I think we need to be exercising that type of restraint, because those power systems can change. And when people in power have the authority to label animal rights and environmental activists as terrorists, and also label militia groups or others because of their politics, it just expands that scope even further.
And then what is the implication for an individual once they've been labeled as a terrorist?
It depends on the circumstances, but what I've seen in my work is that when people are being labeled as terrorists, particularly environmentalists or animal rights activists, and we've seen this as well with the Black Lives Matter movement with the surveillance against them, it can redefine people within the prison system. It can lead to them being sentenced to what are called communications management units, which are experimental prison units for people classified as terrorists. And I think that's yet another striking example of, in these secretive prison units, they're overwhelmingly Muslim. They also have some leftist, environmentalist and animal rights prisoners. But none of that is being discussed in regards to this militia movement. It's not just a rhetorical flourish of using that language. It can radically redefine people in the prison system as well. And I think that's what we're seeing in this militia case because of their privilege simply by being white. They don't have to worry about those same types of concerns.
Author and investigative journalist Will Potter, it's always fascinating to hear from you. His book is Green is the New Red.